Uja Part 1. I had always believed that wealth was a fortress against the vagaries of fate, a bulwark that could shield one from the cruel machinations of a world that delighted in humbling the proud. How wrong I was. How terribly, catastrophically wrong. My name is Alexander Hartwell, and I am, or rather was, what society calls a successful man. At 32, I commanded an empire built on technology and innovation, my company's stock price a daily testament to my supposed brilliance. My penthouse overlooked the city like a throne room, and my bank account bore numbers that would make lesser men weep with envy. Yet, on this particular October evening, as I sat in my leather chair overlooking the glittering metropolis below, I felt nothing but the hollow ache of a man who had lost everything that truly mattered. The invitation lay before me on my mahogany desk, its cream-colored paper mocking me with its elegant script. Victoria Sinclair cordially invites you to witness her union with James Morrison. The words blurred before my eyes. Not from tears, I had shed those already, but from a rage so pure it seemed to distort reality itself. Victoria. My Victoria, the woman who had promised to stand by my side through fortune and folly, who had worn my ring for 2 years, who had planned our future with the meticulous care of an architect designing a cathedral. She had left me 3 months ago, claiming that I had become cold and distant, that my success had transformed me into someone she no longer recognized. The irony was not lost on me. She left me for my wealth's effect on my character, only to marry a man whose family fortune dwarfed even my own. I rose from my chair, the city lights painting shadows across my face that must have resembled the very demons I felt clawing at my chest. The wedding was in 2 days. 2 days to endure the spectacle of watching the only woman I had ever loved pledge herself to another. 2 days to maintain the facade of indifference that society demanded of men like me. But as I stood there, glass of bourbon untouched in my hand, an idea began to form. Not revenge, for I am not a vindictive man by nature, but rather a desperate gambit to prove something to myself, to Victoria, to the world that had relegated me to the role of discarded suitor. I would attend this wedding, yes, but not as the pathetic figure they all expected, not as the bitter ex-fiancé nursing his wounds in solitude. The rain had begun to fall, drumming against my floor-to-ceiling windows like fingers tapping out a funeral dirge. I set down my glass and reached for my coat, and reached. Sometimes the most profound decisions are made not in moments of clarity, but in moments of complete and utter confusion, when the heart overrules the mind so thoroughly that logic becomes a foreign concept. I stepped into the night, my expensive shoes clicking against wet pavement as I walked without destination through streets I had never truly seen, despite passing them countless times in my chauffeur-driven car. The city looked different from ground level, more human somehow, less like a kingdom to be conquered, and more like a living, breathing organism, of which I was merely one small part. It was then that I saw her. She sat huddled beneath the awning of a closed bookstore, her small frame wrapped in layers of clothing that had seen better decades. Her hair, once perhaps blonde or light brown, hung in matted strands around a face that might have been beautiful had it not been carved by hardship into something almost ethereal in its fragility. She couldn't have been more than 25, yet her eyes held the weight of someone who had lived several lifetimes of suffering. Our eyes met across the rain-slicked street, and in that instant, something shifted in my chest, not the romantic awakening that poets write about, but something deeper and more unsettling. Recognition, perhaps, though not of her face, but of something in her expression that mirrored my own inner desolation. I should have walked on. A man of my position does not stop to engage with the homeless, not out of cruelty, but out of the simple understanding that our worlds are separated by more than money. They are separated by experiences so fundamentally different that meaningful connection seems impossible. Yet my feet carried me across the street before my mind could mount a proper protest. "Excuse me," I said, my voice sounding foreign in the rain-soaked air. She looked up at me with eyes the color of storm clouds, wary but not afraid. There was intelligence there, sharp and bright despite her circumstances. "I'm not asking for money," she said, her voice carrying the cadence of education, the articulation of someone who had once moved in circles not entirely unlike my own. This revelation struck me like a physical blow. "I wasn't assuming you were," I replied, though I realized that, in truth, I had been. "I was wondering if you might be interested in a proposition." She studied me for a long moment, taking in my expensive coat, my perfectly styled hair, the watch that cost more than most people earn in a year. "What kind of proposition?" The words tumbled out before I had fully formed them in my mind. "I need a date to a wedding, a very important wedding. Someone who won't ask questions about my motivations or judge the unconventional nature of the arrangement." She laughed then, a sound so unexpected and genuine that it cut through the rain and the city noise like a bell. "You're joking." "I'm entirely serious. The event is formal, but I can provide appropriate attire. You would be compensated, of course, and fed well and treated with complete respect. All I ask is that you accompany me and allow people to draw their own conclusions about our relationship." She was quiet for so long that I began to wonder if I had offended her irreparably. Finally, she spoke. "What's your name?" "Alexander Hartwell." Her eyebrows rose slightly. "The tech mogul. I've read about you in newspapers I've found in dumpsters." There was no accusation in her voice, merely statement of fact. "And I'm supposed to believe that you, one of the city's most eligible bachelors, can't find a real date to this wedding?" The honesty of the question demanded an honest answer. "The wedding is of my former fiancé. I suspect that most women of my usual acquaintance would either refuse out of propriety or accept for the wrong reasons. I need someone who has nothing to gain from the association beyond what I offer directly." She considered this, her head tilted slightly as rain continued to fall around us. "And what exactly are you offering directly?" $5,000, cash. No questions asked about how you spend it. I paused, studying her face for any sign of what she might be thinking. "Plus a weekend of comfort, good food and shelter." "You realize how this sounds, don't you?" she asked, but there was no judgment in her tone, only curiosity. "I realize how it might sound, yes, but I assure you my intentions are entirely proper. This is purely a business arrangement designed to serve my emotional needs in what will be a difficult situation." She was quiet again, and I found myself holding my breath. Why her acceptance mattered so much to me, I couldn't say. Perhaps it was simply that in her eyes, I saw someone who understood what it meant to be utterly alone in a world full of people. "My name is Lily," she said finally. "Lily Chen. And Mr. Hartwell, you should know that I'm homeless, not stupid. I understand exactly what you're asking and why you're asking it. The question is whether you understand what you're getting into." "Meaning?" "Meaning that if I show up on your arm at this wedding, people are going to talk. They're going to make assumptions and judgments that you might not be prepared for. Your reputation might suffer." I considered this, surprised by her concern for my welfare. My reputation has survived worse scandals than being seen with an unconventional companion. "Has it survived being seen with a homeless woman?" she asked pointedly. The question hung in the air between us like a challenge. Had it? In truth, I didn't know. My social circle moved in predictable patterns, their scandals limited to affairs with married socialites or business dealings of questionable ethics. Bringing a homeless woman to the wedding of the year would be unprecedented in our insular world. "I suppose we'll find out together," I said. She smiled then, the first genuine smile I had seen cross her features, and it transformed her face completely. For a moment, I could see the woman she might have been in different circumstances, confident, radiant, formidable. "All right, Alexander Hartwell," she said, rising to her feet with a grace that seemed at odds with her circumstances. "I accept your proposition, but I have conditions of my own." "Name them." "First, I want to know why you're really doing this. Not the surface reason about needing a date, but the real reason." I found myself answering more honestly than I had intended. Because I want to prove that I'm not the man she thinks I am. Or perhaps because I want to prove that I am exactly the man she thinks I am, and that it doesn't matter. She nodded as if this made perfect sense. Second condition, we do this properly. If I'm going to be your date to this wedding, then I'm going to be your date, not your charity case. I won't be treated like a prop or a pet project. Agreed. Third, after the wedding, we part ways cleanly. No lingering obligations on either side, no attempts to save me or continue whatever this is beyond its stated purpose. This condition struck me as both practical and somehow sad, if that's what you prefer. It is. She extended her hand to me, a formal gesture that seemed almost absurd given our surroundings, but somehow entirely appropriate. Do we have a deal? I took her hand, surprised by the firmness of her grip and the calluses that spoke of hard physical work. We have a deal. As we stood there in the rain, her small hand in mine, I had the strangest sensation that I had just set in motion a chain of events that would alter both our lives in ways neither of us could anticipate. There was something about Lily Chen that defied easy categorization, something that suggested her homelessness was perhaps more recent and more complicated than I had initially assumed. "Where are you staying tonight?" I asked, reluctant to let her disappear back into the shadows of the city. "I'll find somewhere," she said with the casual air of someone accustomed to such uncertainties. "No," I said, surprising myself with the firmness of my tone. "If we're going to do this properly, as you said, then it starts now. You'll stay at my place tonight. We'll get you cleaned up, fed, and properly dressed. The wedding is tomorrow evening." She studied my face carefully. "Your place? I have more than enough room, I assure you." And I meant what I said about treating you with complete respect. For a moment, I thought she might refuse, and I realized how desperately I hoped she wouldn't. Not because I needed her for the wedding, though I did, but because something about her presence made the world seem less empty than it had mere minutes before. "All right," she said finally, "but I should warn you, Mr. Hartwell, that homeless people don't always smell like roses." I found myself laughing despite the gravity of our situation. "I think I can manage." As we walked through the rain-soaked streets toward my building, I found myself stealing glances at this woman who had so readily agreed to my desperate scheme. What circumstances had brought her to the streets? What stories lay behind those intelligent eyes? And why did I have the unsettling feeling that in trying to prove something to my ex-fiancée, I might instead discover something about myself that I wasn't prepared to face? The doorman's eyes widened slightly as we approached my building, his professional composure wavering just enough to let me know that my appearance with Lily had not gone unnoticed. I nodded to him curtly, daring him to comment, and he simply smiled and opened the door. "Good evening, Mr. Hartwell," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "Good evening, Marcus. This is Miss Chen. She'll be staying as my guest." "Of course, sir. Shall I arrange for anything special?" I glanced at Lily, who was taking in the marble lobby with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Perhaps some dinner from Romano's, whatever they recommend tonight." "Very good, sir." The elevator ride to my penthouse was conducted in silence, both of us lost in our own thoughts. I found myself wondering what she made of my world. This vertical palace that had always seemed like the natural result of hard work and ambition, but which now, seen through her eyes, felt almost obscenely luxurious. When the elevator doors opened directly into my foyer, Lily stepped out slowly, her gaze taking in the artwork, the furniture, the floor-to-ceiling windows that revealed the city spread out below us like a carpet of stars. "My God," she whispered, and I heard in her voice not envy, but something closer to sadness. "You live like this every day?" "Yes," I said, suddenly ashamed of the answer. She walked to the windows, pressing her palm against the glass. "All those lights," she said softly. "All those lives happening simultaneously, each one thinking they're the center of the universe." There was something profound in her observation, something that made me see my view differently than I ever had before. Usually, when I looked out these windows, I saw a kingdom I had conquered. Through her eyes, I saw something larger and more humbling, a vast network of human experience of which my own story was just one small thread. "Lily," I said, and she turned to look at me. "Before we go any further with this arrangement, I need to ask you something." "What? How long have you been homeless?" She was quiet for a long moment, her eyes returning to the view beyond the glass. 6 months, she said finally. 6 months, 12 days, and approximately 14 hours. The precision of her answer told me more than she probably intended. "What happened 6 months and 12 days ago?" She smiled, but it was not a happy expression. "That, Mr. Hartwell, is a story for another time. Right now, I believe you mentioned something about getting cleaned up and fed." I could have pressed the issue, but something in her tone warned me against it. Instead, I nodded and led her down the hallway to the guest suite. "This is your room," I said, opening the door to reveal a space that was probably larger than many people's entire homes. "The bathroom is through there, and you'll find everything you need. Take as much time as you like." She stepped into the room, running her hand along the silk wallpaper. "Alexander," she said, using my first name for the first time. "Yes? Are you absolutely certain you want to go through with this? Because once we walk into that wedding tomorrow, there's no taking it back. People will see us together, and they'll draw their conclusions. And some of those conclusions might follow you for a very long time." I looked at her standing there in my guest room, this woman who had emerged from the rain like some sort of avenging angel, and I realized that I had never been more certain of anything in my life. "I'm certain," I said. She nodded. "Then I'll see you at dinner, Mr. Hartwell." As I closed the door behind me and walked back to my study, I poured myself another bourbon and tried to process what I had just committed myself to. In less than 24 hours, I would walk into Victoria's wedding with a homeless woman on my arm. The social implications were staggering, the potential damage to my reputation incalculable. And yet, for the first time in months, I felt truly alive. Part 2. I awoke the next morning with the peculiar sensation that the world had shifted on its axis while I slept. Sunlight streamed through my bedroom windows, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny spirits in the air. And for a moment, I wondered if the previous evening had been nothing more than an elaborate dream conjured by my troubled mind. But then, I heard the soft sound of movement from the guest wing, and reality came flooding back with all its attendant anxieties and strange exhilarations. Lily was here in my home, preparing to accompany me to what would undoubtedly be the most challenging social event of my adult life. I dressed with unusual care, selecting a charcoal suit that had been tailored to perfection, though I wondered if any amount of sartorial armor could prepare me for what lay ahead. When I emerged from my room, I found her in the kitchen, standing by the window with a cup of coffee cradled in her hands. She had bathed, and her hair, clean now and catching the morning light, revealed itself to be a rich chestnut brown with threads of gold that spoke of hours spent in sunlight during happier times. She wore one of my spare bathrobes, which hung loose on her small frame, yet somehow she managed to invest even this simple garment with an unconscious dignity that struck me as remarkable. "Good morning," I said, my voice sounding unnaturally formal in the intimate space of my kitchen. She turned, and I was struck again by the intelligence in her eyes, now clearer without the veil of exhaustion and despair that had clouded them the night before. "Good morning, Alexander. I hope you don't mind that I helped myself to coffee. I found everything I needed." "Of course not. Did you sleep well?" A small smile played at the corners of her mouth. "Better than I have in 6 months and 13 days. The precision of her timekeeping continued to intrigue me, suggesting a mind that found comfort in the measurement of pain, in the careful cataloguing of loss. I poured myself coffee and joined her by the window. From this vantage point, the city below looked peaceful in the morning light, its harsh edges softened by distance and the golden hue of early sunshine. "We should discuss today's arrangements," I said, though in truth I found myself reluctant to break the spell of this quiet domestic scene. "Yes," she agreed. "The practical matters. I've arranged for a stylist to come this afternoon. She's very discreet and accustomed to working with challenging timelines. She'll bring several options for you to choose from." Lily nodded, but I detected a subtle tension in her shoulders. "What have you told her about me?" "Nothing beyond the fact that I need appropriate formal wear for a companion attending an evening wedding. She asks no questions beyond what's necessary for her work." "And what story are we telling everyone else? About who I am, how we met, what our relationship is?" This question had occupied much of my sleepless hours the previous night. "We tell them as little as possible and let them draw their own conclusions. If pressed, we can say we met through mutual friends and found each other's company agreeable." "Mutual friends," she repeated, amusement coloring her voice. "That's certainly one way to describe the circumstances of our meeting." I found myself studying her profile as she gazed out at the city. There were questions I wanted to ask, mysteries about her past that gnawed at my curiosity, but something in her demeanor warned me against probing too deeply. Instead, I asked something safer. "Are you nervous?" "Terrified," she replied with such honesty that it caught me off guard. "Are you?" "Absolutely." We stood there in companionable silence, two people about to embark on what might charitably be called an adventure and more accurately described as potential social suicide. Yet there was something comforting about her presence, something that made the prospect of facing Victoria and her new husband feel less like walking into a battle and more like, well, perhaps it was still a battle, but at least I would not be fighting it alone. "Alexander," she said, using my first name again with that same careful deliberation, "I want you to understand something. Whatever happens tonight, whatever people say or think, I won't be ashamed of who I am or where I come from. If that creates problems for you, now would be the time to reconsider." Her words carried a quiet strength that I found both admirable and slightly intimidating. "I wouldn't ask you to be ashamed," I said, "and I won't be ashamed of you." She turned to face me fully, her storm-colored eyes searching mine. "Easy words to say in the comfort of your penthouse. Less easy when you're standing in a room full of people who believe they know exactly what kind of person you are and what kind of person you should be with." There was wisdom in her observation, born no doubt from experience with judgment and prejudice that I, in my privileged position, had rarely encountered. "Then I suppose we'll discover together what kind of man I really am." "Yes," she said quietly, "I suppose we will." The rest of the morning passed in a strange suspension of normalcy. I attempted to work, reviewing contracts and responding to emails, but found my concentration fractured. Lily had retreated to her room, claiming she wanted to rest before the afternoon's preparations. But I suspected she needed solitude to steel herself for what lay ahead. The stylist, Miranda, arrived precisely at 2 o'clock with an entourage of assistants and enough garment bags to outfit a small theater company. I made the introductions as briefly as possible and then retreated to my study, though I found it impossible to focus on anything beyond the muffled sounds of activity from the guest suite. It was nearly 4 o'clock when Miranda knocked on my study door. She was a woman of perhaps 50, with silver hair and the kind of effortless elegance that came from decades of dressing the wealthy and powerful. "Mr. Hartwell," she said, "I wanted to speak with you privately before I leave." "Of course. Is everything satisfactory?" She closed the door behind her and took a seat across from my desk, her expression thoughtful. "Your companion is remarkable. I've been in this business for 25 years, and I've dressed senators' wives, movie stars, and European nobility, but I've never worked with someone who possessed such natural grace while simultaneously seeming so utterly unaware of her own beauty. I felt an unexpected surge of something that might have been pride, though I had no right to such feelings regarding a woman I had known for less than 24 hours. "She's quite extraordinary," I agreed. "May I ask how long you've been together?" The question caught me off guard, and I realized that Miranda had drawn her own conclusions about the nature of my relationship with Lily. "It's complicated," I said, which was certainly true, if not entirely informative. Miranda smiled knowingly. The best relationships usually are. I should warn you, however, that she's going to cause quite a stir tonight. The transformation is, well, you'll see for yourself. After Miranda and her team departed, I found myself pacing my study like a caged animal, alternately eager and terrified to see Lily in her wedding attire. I had attended hundreds of formal events, had escorted beautiful women to galas and premieres, but I could not remember ever feeling this particular combination of anticipation and dread. At 6 o'clock, I emerged from my room, dressed in my formal evening wear, adjusting my cufflinks with hands that were, I was mortified to notice, slightly trembling. I waited in the living room, the city lights beginning to twinkle beyond my windows as evening approached, and tried to prepare myself for whatever version of Lily would emerge. When I heard the soft sound of heels on marble, I turned, and the breath left my lungs as though I had been struck by a physical blow. The woman who walked into my living room bore little resemblance to the bedraggled figure I had encountered in the rain. Miranda had chosen a gown of midnight blue silk that seemed to capture and reflect light like still water, cut in clean lines that emphasized Lily's slender figure without being ostentatious. Her hair had been styled in a low chignon that revealed the elegant line of her neck, and subtle makeup had enhanced her natural features without masking them. But it was not the external transformation that rendered me speechless. It was the way she carried herself, with a poise and confidence that seemed to emanate from some deep well of inner strength. "Will I do?" she asked, and I detected a note of uncertainty beneath her composed exterior. I began, then found I had no adequate words. "You're perfect." A faint blush colored her cheeks. "Miranda is a magician." I hardly recognized myself. But I suspected that what I was seeing was not a creation of the stylist's art, but rather Lily, as she was meant to be, freed from the constraints of circumstance and desperation. This was who she had been before whatever catastrophe had driven her to the streets, and glimpsing it felt like a privilege I had not earned. I offered her my arm, and as she took it, I caught the faint scent of jasmine, perfume that Miranda had chosen with her usual impeccable taste. "Are you ready for this?" I asked. "No," she replied with characteristic honesty, "but I've learned that readiness is a luxury few of us can afford. Sometimes we simply have to move forward and hope for the best." The ride to the wedding venue passed in relative silence, both of us lost in our own thoughts as my driver navigated the evening traffic. Lily sat beside me with perfect posture, her hands folded in her lap, but I could sense the tension thrumming beneath her composed exterior. I found myself wanting to reach for her hand, to offer some gesture of comfort or solidarity, but our arrangement was purely business, and I had no right to such intimacies. The wedding was being held at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the entire Great Hall transformed into what could only be described as a fairy tale palace. Flowers cascaded from every surface, thousands of white roses and peonies, creating an atmosphere of ethereal beauty that spoke of unlimited budget and flawless taste. Victoria had always possessed impeccable aesthetic sensibilities, and she had outdone herself for this occasion. As our car joined the line of vehicles depositing guests at the entrance, I felt my chest tighten with a familiar ache. Somewhere inside that building, Victoria was preparing to marry another man, to make promises to him that she had once made to me. The rational part of my mind knew that I should feel nothing but happiness for her, but rationality had little power over the heart's stubborn refusal to release its claims. "Second thoughts?" Lily asked softly, her perceptive eyes noting my tension. "About bringing you?" "No." "About coming at all?" "Several." "We could leave," she offered. "Tell your driver to take us somewhere else. Dinner, perhaps, or a movie. Something normal and uncomplicated." The suggestion was tempting in its simplicity, but I shook my head. "No, I need to do this. Not for her, but for myself. I need to prove that I can face this moment with dignity." "Then that's what we'll do," she said with quiet conviction. Our car pulled up to the entrance. and I saw the photographer's flash already beginning to pop as other guests made their grand entrances. In moments, we would be among them, exposed to scrutiny and speculation. I looked at Lily one final time, this remarkable woman who had agreed to stand beside me in what might prove to be social catastrophe. "Thank you," I said, meaning it more deeply than she could know. "Don't thank me yet," she replied with a slight smile. "The evening is young, and disaster has a way of revealing itself gradually." The car door opened, and I stepped out first, then turned to offer Lily my hand. As she emerged from the vehicle with fluid grace, I heard the subtle shift in the crowd's murmur, the way conversations paused and resumed with added intensity. She was, as Miranda had predicted, causing quite a stir. We walked up the museum steps together, her hand light on my arm, and I felt the weight of dozens of gazes upon us. I recognized many faces in the crowd. Business associates, social acquaintances, members of the same privileged circle that had shaped my entire adult life. Their expressions ranged from curiosity to surprise to what might charitably be called interest, though some carried undertones that were less generous. "Alexander!" The voice belonged to Charles Whitmore, an old family friend and business partner. He approached with his wife Helen in tow, both of them wearing expressions of barely contained fascination. "How wonderful to see you here." "Charles? Helen?" I nodded to each in turn. "I'd like you to meet Lily Chen." "Lily, Charles, and Helen Whitmore." Lily extended her hand with perfect composure. "How do you do?" "Charmed," Charles replied, though his eyes held a calculating quality that I didn't like. "I don't believe we've met before. Are you new to the city?" "I've been here for some time," Lily replied smoothly, answering without really answering, a skill that required considerable social sophistication. "And how did you and Alexander meet?" Helen pressed, her smile sharp as a blade. I felt Lily's hand tighten almost imperceptibly on my arm. "Through mutual friends," I said, deploying the story we had agreed upon. "We discovered a shared appreciation for literary discussions." It was a safe lie, the kind of cultured connection that our social circle would find both plausible and appropriately refined. But as the words left my mouth, I realized that they might not be entirely false. There had been something in Lily's manner of speaking, her precise articulation and thoughtful observations, that suggested a mind well acquainted with books and ideas. "How lovely," Helen said, though her tone suggested she found it anything but. "Well, we mustn't keep you. I'm sure you're eager to find your seats." As they moved away, I caught Charles whispering something to his wife, their heads bent together in the universal posture of gossip being shared. I felt a flash of anger on Lily's behalf, but when I glanced at her, she appeared unruffled by the encounter. "That went better than I expected," she murmured, as we made our way into the great hall. "They were rude. They were curious. In their position, I might have been the same." Her magnanimity in the face of barely disguised hostility struck me as remarkable, though I wondered if it was born of genuine forgiveness, or simply the weary acceptance of someone who had grown accustomed to being judged. The great hall had been transformed beyond recognition, its soaring architecture serving as a backdrop for an elaborate floral wonderland. Hundreds of guests milled about, champagne flutes in hand, their evening wear creating a kaleidoscope of color against the museum's classical backdrop. And there, near the impromptu altar that had been erected beneath the hall's famous archway, stood Victoria. Even from across the room, she was luminous. Her wedding dress was a masterpiece of design, flowing silk and delicate lace that seemed to capture and amplify every beam of light. Her dark hair was swept up in an elaborate style, crowned with a tiara that caught the light like captured stars. She was laughing at something her maid of honor had whispered, her face radiant with happiness, and the sight of her joy struck me like a physical blow. "She's beautiful," Lily said softly, following my gaze. "Yes," I managed, my voice rougher than I had intended. "She is. Do you still love her?" The question was asked without judgment, merely as a statement of fact to be confirmed or denied. I considered lying, offering some polite deflection, but Lily's honesty deserved honesty in return. "I don't know," I said. "I love who she was, who I thought she was. Whether I love who she actually is, that's a more complicated question." Lily nodded as though this made perfect sense. Love is often less about the other person than about who we become when we're with them. Perhaps what you're mourning is not her, but the version of yourself that existed in relationship to her. Her insight was so acute, so perfectly articulated, that I found myself staring at her in amazement. "That's remarkably perceptive. Homelessness provides ample time for philosophical reflection," she replied with dark humor. "When you have nothing but time and thoughts for company, you develop a certain clarity about human nature." Before I could respond, I heard my name called from behind us. I turned to find James Morrison, the groom himself, approaching with a wide smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. James was everything I was not: old money where I was new money, patrician features where mine were more rugged, inherited wealth where mine was earned. He was also, I was forced to admit, a genuinely good man who would likely make Victoria very happy. "Alexander, I'm so glad you decided to come." His handshake was firm, his manner genuinely warm, despite what must have been an awkward situation for him. "Victoria will be thrilled to see you here." I doubted this was entirely true, but I appreciated his diplomatic grace. "Congratulations, James. You're marrying an extraordinary woman." "I am indeed." His smile became more genuine. "And who is this lovely lady?" "James Morrison, may I present Lily Chen. Lily, James, is the fortunate groom." Lily extended her hand with that same perfect composure she had shown with the Whitmores. "Congratulations on your wedding. The ceremony promises to be beautiful." "Thank you. I hope you'll both enjoy the evening." James paused, and I could see him processing something, perhaps the incongruity of my bringing a completely unknown woman to his wedding, or perhaps simply trying to place Lily within his mental catalogue of our social circle. "I don't believe we've met before, Miss Chen. Are you in the city often?" "I live here," Lily replied simply. "Ah, wonderful. In what area?" It was an innocent question, the kind of social small talk that filled such gatherings, but I felt Lily stiffen beside me. How could she answer truthfully that she lived on the streets, in doorways and shelters, when she was lucky enough to find space? "We're still getting settled," I interjected smoothly. "You know how it is with real estate in the city." James laughed. "Indeed I do." "Well, I should return to my bride before she sends a search party. Please, enjoy yourselves this evening." As he walked away, I felt Lily release a breath she had been holding. "Thank you," she murmured. "We're partners in this," I reminded her. "We protect each other." She looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite interpret. "Is that what we're doing?" Before I could answer, the string quartet began playing the processional, and all conversation ceased as guests took their seats. I guided Lily to our assigned places, close enough to the front to indicate my importance in Victoria's life, but not so close as to suggest anything inappropriate. As we settled into our chairs, I was acutely aware of the whispered conversations continuing around us, the sidelong glances and speculative looks that followed our every movement. The ceremony itself passed in a blur of traditional vows and classical music. Victoria glided down the aisle on her father's arm like something out of a dream, and when James lifted her veil to kiss his new wife, the assembled guests erupted in applause that seemed to echo off the museum's high ceilings. I watched it all with the detached air of someone observing a play, conscious that I was witnessing the final, irrevocable severing of whatever connection had once existed between Victoria and myself. And yet, instead of the devastating grief I had expected, I felt something closer to relief, as though a chapter of my life that had been left incomplete was finally reaching its proper conclusion. Beside me, Lily sat with perfect posture, her hands folded in her lap, her attention focused on the ceremony with what appeared to be genuine interest. Occasionally, our arms would brush as we shifted in our seats, and each time I was struck by the strange comfort her presence provided. Whatever happened next, whatever scrutiny and speculation awaited us at the reception, I was grateful not to be facing it alone. Part 3. The reception hall glittered like something conjured from the pages of a fairy tale, though I suspected that even the brothers Grimm might have found such opulence excessive. Crystal chandeliers cast prismatic light across tables laden with flowers whose cost could have fed a family for months, while an orchestra played softly from a dais decorated with enough white roses to stock a funeral parlor. It was, I realized with bitter irony, exactly the kind of wedding Victoria and I had once planned for ourselves, back when such displays of wealth seemed like natural expressions of happiness rather than monuments to excess. Lily moved beside me through this glittering landscape with a grace that seemed almost supernatural, her midnight blue gown catching the light as she navigated conversations with perfect composure. I found myself watching her as much as I watched the other guests, fascinated by the way she could appear completely at ease while simultaneously maintaining the alertness of someone accustomed to potential danger. She was, I was beginning to understand, a woman of remarkable contradictions. Alexander, darling. The voice belonged to Margaret Ashford, a woman whose primary occupation was the collection and dissemination of social gossip. She descended upon us with the predatory grace of a hawk spotting prey, her heavily jeweled fingers already reaching for Lily's arm. You simply must introduce me to your mysterious companion. I performed the introductions with resigned politeness, watching as Margaret's sharp eyes catalogued every detail of Lily's appearance, searching for clues to her identity and origins. It was a process I had witnessed countless times. The way our social circle processed newcomers like data being fed into some elaborate algorithm designed to determine worth and position. Chen, Margaret mused, rolling the name around in her mouth like a sommelier testing wine. Chinese ancestry, I presume. How exotic, and what do you do, my dear? It was the question I had been dreading, the one that could unravel our carefully constructed facade in an instant. I felt myself tense, prepared to intervene, but Lily answered with such smooth confidence that I wondered if she had spent the day rehearsing responses to exactly this sort of inquiry. I work with urban development projects, she said, which was technically not a lie, if one considered sleeping in doorways and abandoned buildings a form of urban interface. Community outreach, primarily. Margaret's eyes lit up with the fervor of someone who had scented a story. How fascinating. And which organization do you work for? I prefer to keep my professional and personal lives separate, Lily replied, with a smile that managed to be both polite and utterly final. I find that mixing business with social occasions can be terribly dull for everyone involved. It was a masterful deflection, the kind of response that our social circle was trained to accept without further probing, and I felt a surge of admiration for her quick thinking. Margaret looked momentarily frustrated, but was forced to accept the conversational boundary Lily had established. Of course, dear. How refreshing to meet someone who maintains such professional discretion. Margaret's smile had taken on a brittle quality. Alexander, you've been keeping this lovely creature far too much to yourself. We simply must have you both to dinner next week. The invitation was clearly motivated more by curiosity than genuine hospitality, and I was preparing a polite deflection when Lily responded first. How kind of you to offer, she said warmly. Unfortunately, my work requires quite a bit of travel, so my schedule is rather unpredictable. But perhaps when things settle down. Another perfect response, gracious but non-committal, accepting the invitation without creating any actual obligation. Margaret was forced to smile and move on, though I caught her casting speculative glances back at us as she rejoined the crowd. Nicely handled, I murmured to Lily as we moved toward our assigned table. Margaret Ashford has been a fixture in the society pages for 30 years, Lily replied quietly. She's written about in every gossip column and lifestyle magazine in the city. Knowing how to deflect her questions isn't exactly advanced social science. Her knowledge of our social ecosystem surprised me, though I was beginning to realize that Lily's awareness of the world around her was far more comprehensive than I had initially assumed. You've clearly done your research. I've read a lot of discarded newspapers over the past 6 months, she said with characteristic directness. Your social circle generates a remarkable amount of press coverage. We reached our table, where I recognized several faces from my business and social circles. The introductions that followed were variations on the same theme, polite curiosity barely concealing avid speculation about the identity and origins of my mysterious companion. Lily handled each encounter with the same perfect blend of warmth and discretion, revealing nothing while appearing to be completely open and forthcoming. As the first course was served, some architectural arrangement of microgreens and foam that would have been at home in a modern art museum, I found myself studying the other guests and trying to see them through Lily's eyes. These were people I had known for years, men and women whose approval and respect I had actively courted, whose social circles had defined the boundaries of my world. Yet tonight, watching them through the lens of Lily's presence, I saw them differently. There was something almost performative about their interactions, a quality of elaborate theater in which everyone knew their roles but no one questioned the script. Conversations followed predictable patterns, touching on acceptable topics in approved ways, while beneath the surface currents of competition and status assessment flowed like underground rivers. It was a world I had navigated successfully for years, but tonight it felt foreign and slightly absurd. "Penny, for your thoughts," Lily said quietly, leaning slightly toward me as the conversation around our table focused on someone's recent acquisition of a vineyard in Tuscany. "I was thinking that I've never noticed how orchestrated all of this is," I replied honestly. "Like everyone is following a script they've memorized but never actually read." She smiled, a genuine expression that transformed her face completely. "Every social group has its rituals and codes. These are no different from any others, just more expensive. Is that what you see when you look at all this? Just another set of social codes?" "I see people trying very hard to prove they belong to something meaningful," she said thoughtfully. "The tragedy is that most of them have forgotten what that something actually is." Her observation struck me with uncomfortable accuracy. When had I last attended a social event because I genuinely wanted to be there, rather than because it was expected of me? When had I last had a conversation at one of these gatherings that touched on anything more substantial than stock prices and vacation destinations? The evening progressed through its predictable stages, dinner courses accompanied by increasingly animated conversation as the wine flowed, followed by speeches that balanced humor with sentiment in carefully measured proportions. Victoria's father spoke about welcoming James into the family. James thanked everyone for their presence and support, and various friends and relatives offered toasts that managed to be both heartfelt and utterly conventional. Through it all, I found myself watching Victoria with the detached curiosity of an anthropologist studying a fascinating but alien culture. She was radiant. That much was undeniable, glowing with the kind of happiness that seemed to emanate from every pore. When she laughed at James's gentle humor during his speech, when she dabbed at her eyes during her father's more emotional moments, when she accepted congratulations from the parade of well-wishers who approached the head table, she appeared to be exactly where she wanted to be, with exactly the person she wanted to be there with. It should have been devastating to watch. For months, I had tortured myself with images of this day, imagining the pain I would feel when confronted with the reality of her happiness with another man. Yet as I sat there, Lily's presence a warm constant beside me, I felt something unexpected. Genuine gladness for Victoria's joy, unmarred by the bitterness I had anticipated. "She looks happy," Lily observed, following my gaze. "She does. Are you all right with that?" I considered her question seriously, surprised by my own answer. "Yes, I think I am." It was then that Victoria rose from her seat at the head table and began making her way through the crowd, accepting congratulations and best wishes from the assembled guests. I realized with a combination of anticipation and dread that she was moving systematically through the room, and our table would inevitably be included in her circuit. "She's coming over here," I said quietly to Lily. I assumed she would. This is her wedding after all. She can hardly ignore her former fiancé. The casual way Lily spoke about the situation, as though it were merely another social challenge to be navigated rather than an emotional minefield, helped steady my nerves. By the time Victoria reached our table, I had composed myself into what I hoped was an expression of appropriate congratulations, without any underlying emotional subtext. Alexander. Victoria's voice was warm but careful, the tone of someone determined to handle a potentially awkward situation with grace. She looked magnificent up close, her happiness giving her an almost ethereal glow that the photographer's lights couldn't fully capture. "I'm so glad you came." I rose to greet her, and for a moment we simply looked at each other. Two people who had once planned to spend their lives together, now meeting as polite strangers at her wedding to another man. The moment stretched longer than it should have, freighted with years of shared history and all the words that had never been spoken between us. "Congratulations, Victoria," I said finally, meaning it more than I had expected to. "You look absolutely radiant." "Thank you." Her smile was genuine, relieved perhaps that I had managed the appropriate tone. Then her gaze shifted to Lily, who had risen beside me with fluid grace, and I saw Victoria's eyes widen slightly as she took in the full impact of my companion's presence. "Victoria, I'd like you to meet Lily Chen." "Lily, this is Victoria Morrison." The two women regarded each other with the particular intensity that exists between women meeting under charged circumstances. Victoria, secure in her happiness and position, was generous in her assessment. Lily, with nothing to lose and no particular reason for deference, was perfectly composed. "Ms. Chen, how lovely to meet you. I hope you're enjoying the evening." "It's a beautiful celebration," Lily replied warmly. "You've created something truly magical here." "Thank you. I don't believe we've met before." "Are you new to the city?" I felt the familiar tension that accompanied any inquiry into Lily's background, but she handled Victoria's question with the same skillful misdirection she had employed all evening. "I've been here for some time, actually. Alexander and I met through mutual friends." Victoria's gaze shifted between us, and I could see her processing this information, trying to place Lily within the context of people and relationships she knew. There was curiosity there, but also something that might have been relief, as though she had been worried about how I would handle this day and was pleased to see me apparently thriving. "How wonderful. I hope we'll have the chance to get to know each other better in the future." Victoria turned back to me, her expression softening. "Alexander, could I speak with you privately for just a moment?" It was not really a request, and I found myself nodding despite my uncertainty about what such a conversation might entail. I glanced at Lily, who smiled encouragingly. "I'll be fine here," she assured me. "Take your time." Victoria led me to a relatively quiet corner of the reception hall, away from the main flow of guests, but still visible to anyone who cared to observe our interaction. She stood facing me, her hands clasped in front of her, and for a moment she looked exactly as she had when we were together, vulnerable beneath her polished exterior, seeking connection despite her fears. "I wasn't sure you would come," she began, her voice barely audible above the orchestral music and conversation that filled the hall. "I wasn't sure I would either. I'm glad you did. It means a great deal to me, having you here, having your blessing, I suppose." The word hung between us, weighted with significance. A blessing implied forgiveness, acceptance, perhaps even approval. Did I have those things to offer her? "You don't need my blessing, Victoria. You never did." "Perhaps not, but I wanted it anyway." She paused, studying my face with the intensity of someone trying to decode a familiar language that had somehow become foreign. "You look well, happy even." "Do I?" "Yes. Different than before. Less," she searched for the right word, "less burdened somehow." It was an astute observation, and I found myself wondering if she was right. Did I feel less burdened? The weight of anger and resentment that had pressed down on me for months seemed to have lifted without my noticing, replaced by something I couldn't quite name. "Your companion is lovely," Victoria continued, "very striking. How long have you been together?" The question was asked casually, but I detected genuine interest beneath the social politeness. Victoria had always been perceptive about people, particularly about relationships and the subtle dynamics that governed them. "It's still quite new," I said, which was certainly true, if inadequate. "She seems grounded, substantial, very different from—" Victoria caught herself, color rising in her cheeks. "I'm sorry. That was inappropriate." "Different from you," I supplied with a slight smile. "She is, in many ways," Victoria nodded, accepting the gentle correction. "I think that might be exactly what you need." There was something profound in her observation, something that suggested she understood aspects of our relationship that I was still discovering myself. We stood there for a moment in the bubble of privacy she had created, two people who had once been intimate strangers, now trying to navigate the delicate territory of former lovers who had found peace. "I should return to my guests," she said finally, "and to James. But Alexander, thank you for coming, for bringing her, for handling all of this with such grace. It couldn't have been easy." "It wasn't," I admitted, "but it was necessary." She reached out and touched my arm briefly, a gesture of affection and closure. "Be happy," she said simply, and then she was gone, swept back into the celebration of her new life. I returned to our table to find Lily engaged in animated conversation with the other guests, her laughter genuine and infectious. She had somehow managed to turn a table of relative strangers into what appeared to be old friends, drawing out stories and observations that had the entire group leaning forward with interest. "How did it go?" she asked quietly as I resumed my seat beside her. "Better than I expected. She seems genuinely happy." "And how do you feel about that?" I considered her question, surprised by my own clarity. "Relieved. Genuinely relieved." She smiled, and something in her expression suggested that she had expected exactly that answer. "Good. That's very good." The evening continued around us. Dancing began as the orchestra shifted to more contemporary music, the older guests gradually giving way to younger couples who filled the dance floor with energy and laughter. I found myself watching it all with a sense of peaceful detachment, as though I were observing from a great height rather than participating directly. "Would you like to dance?" I asked Lily during a particularly romantic song. "I should warn you that I'm somewhat out of practice," she replied, but she rose and took my offered hand. On the dance floor, surrounded by other couples swaying to the gentle rhythm, I discovered that Lily moved with the same unconscious grace she brought to everything else. Her body fit naturally against mine, her hand light in my own, and for the duration of the song, we existed in a bubble of intimacy that felt both artificial and surprisingly genuine. "You dance beautifully," I told her. "Muscle memory," she replied. "Some things you never really forget." It was another tantalizing hint about her past, another suggestion that she had once moved in circles not entirely unlike this one. But before I could pursue the subject, the song ended and we returned to our table, where several couples were preparing to leave. "I think we've made our appearance," I said to Lily, as we watched the gradual exodus of guests. "We can go whenever you're ready." She nodded, and I could see fatigue beginning to show around the edges of her composure. It had been a long day, and the constant performance required to maintain her role in this elaborate charade must have been exhausting. We made our farewells, polite thank yous to the hosts, promises to get together soon with people we would probably never see again, the ritualistic closing of a social event. As we waited for our car, I found myself looking back at the museum, its classical facade now illuminated against the night sky like a temple to some ancient god of wealth and privilege. "Well," Lily said as we settled into the back seat for the ride home, "that was certainly an experience. Any regrets? About tonight? No. About agreeing to your proposition? Definitely not." She turned to look at me, her face partly shadowed in the dim light of the car's interior. "What about you? Any regrets about bringing a homeless woman to the wedding of the year?" It was a loaded question, designed perhaps to test whether the evening's success had changed my perception of our arrangement or of her. I thought about it seriously, considering all the potential ramifications, the gossip that would undoubtedly follow, the questions that would be asked, the assumptions that would be made about my judgment and character. No regrets, I said finally. In fact, I think it might have been exactly what I needed. She smiled, an expression of genuine warmth that seemed to light up the car's interior. Good. That's very good. As we rode through the city streets, past the glittering towers and darkened shop windows, I found myself reflecting on the evening's events with something approaching wonder. I had expected to spend this night fighting off waves of grief and jealousy, struggling to maintain my composure while watching the woman I loved marry someone else. Instead, I felt oddly cleansed, as though some poison I hadn't even realized I was carrying had been drawn from my system. And beside me sat this remarkable woman who had emerged from the rain like some sort of guardian angel, who had agreed to my desperate proposition and then exceeded every expectation I might have had. She had been poised, gracious, intelligent, and mysterious enough to keep people guessing without creating any actual scandal. She had been, in short, perfect for the role I had asked her to play. But as I watched her profile in the passing streetlights, I realized that I was beginning to want something more than mere performance from her. I was beginning to want to know the real Lily Chen, not the composed woman who had navigated tonight's social minefield with such skill, but the person who had been sitting in a doorway in the rain, who counted her homeless days with mathematical precision, who carried herself with such dignity despite circumstances that would have crushed many others. The car pulled up to my building, and we made our way inside with the comfortable silence of people who had shared a significant experience. In the elevator, as we rose toward my penthouse, I found myself reluctant to see the evening end. Not because I wasn't ready to be alone with my thoughts, but because I wasn't ready to return to the version of myself that existed without her presence. "Lily," I said as we reached my door, "would you consider extending our arrangement just for a few more days while we both adjust to whatever comes next?" She looked at me with those storm-colored eyes that seemed to see more than I was comfortable revealing. "Are you asking me to stay because you're afraid to be alone, or because you genuinely want my company?" It was a fair question, one that demanded honest consideration. "I think," I said slowly, "that I'm asking because I've discovered that I like the person I am when I'm with you better than the person I am when I'm not." She studied my face for a long moment, as though trying to determine the sincerity of my words. Finally, she nodded. "All right, Alexander, a few more days, but we should probably discuss what that means exactly." "Tomorrow," I agreed, "when we've both had time to process tonight." "Tomorrow," she agreed. As she disappeared into the guest suite and I made my way to my own room, I realized that for the first time in months, I was looking forward to tomorrow with something approaching anticipation rather than dread. Whatever happened next, whatever complications or revelations awaited us, I would not be facing them alone. And perhaps, I thought as I finally drifted towards sleep, that made all the difference. Part 4. I awoke the following morning with the peculiar sensation that the world had rearranged itself during the night, as though some cosmic editor had revised the fundamental structure of reality while I slept. Sunlight streamed through my bedroom windows with an intensity that seemed almost accusatory, illuminating corners that had remained shadowed for months, revealing details of my own life that I had somehow ceased to notice. The events of the previous evening returned to me gradually, like photographs developing in a dark room. Victoria's radiant happiness, the curious stares of our social circle, Lily's extraordinary grace under what must have been tremendous pressure. But most vividly, I remembered the moment when Victoria touched my arm and wished me happiness, and the surprising realization that I felt genuinely free of the bitter resentment that had poisoned my thoughts for so many months. I dressed with unusual care, selecting casual clothes that I rarely wore, jeans and a sweater that had languished in my closet, while I pursued the relentless formality that seemed to define my public existence. When I emerged from my room, I found Lily already awake, standing by the kitchen window with a cup of coffee, wearing the same borrowed robe as the day before. The morning light caught the gold threads in her chestnut hair, and I was struck again by the way she could invest even the simplest actions with unconscious elegance. "Good morning," I said, my voice carrying a warmth that surprised me. She turned, and I saw something different in her expression, a softness around her eyes that suggested she too had spent the night processing the previous evening's revelations. "Good morning, Alexander. How are you feeling?" It was a simple question that demanded a complex answer. How was I feeling? Relieved, certainly. Grateful, undoubtedly. But beneath these surface emotions, I detected something more unsettling. A growing awareness that my feelings toward the woman standing before me had evolved far beyond the boundaries of our original arrangement. "Different," I said finally. "Lighter somehow." She smiled, and the simple expression seemed to illuminate the entire room. "I'm glad. You carried that burden for a long time." "Too long," I agreed, pouring myself coffee and joining her by the window. The city spread out below us looked different in the morning light, less like a kingdom to be conquered and more like a community of which we were merely two small parts. "Alexander," she said, her voice taking on the careful cadence I had learned to associate with difficult conversations. "We should discuss what happens next." The inevitability of this conversation had been lurking at the edges of my consciousness since the previous evening, when I had impulsively asked her to extend our arrangement. In the cold light of morning, I was forced to confront the question of what exactly I wanted from her and whether I had any right to want anything at all. "Yes," I said, "we should." She set down her coffee cup and turned to face me fully, her storm-colored eyes serious. "Last night was successful by any measure. We accomplished what you set out to do. You attended Victoria's wedding with dignity. You proved whatever it was you needed to prove to yourself and to others, and you emerged from the experience apparently unscathed. Our original agreement has been fulfilled." The words carried the weight of finality, and I felt something cold settle in my chest at the thought of her departure. "That's true. But you asked me to stay longer, and I need to understand why, both for your sake and for mine." I had known this moment would come, when the careful boundaries of our business arrangement would be tested by the more complex emotions that had developed between us. The question was whether I had the courage to acknowledge those emotions honestly, or whether I would retreat into the safer territory of polite fiction. "Initially," I said slowly, "I think I asked you to stay because I was afraid of returning to the solitude I had lived with for months. Your presence made everything easier somehow, less heavy. And now I think I want you to stay because I'm beginning to understand that what I feel for you extends well beyond gratitude or convenience." The admission hung in the air between us like a bridge waiting to be crossed or burned. Lily studied my face with the intensity of someone trying to decode a message written in a language she only partially understood. "Alexander," she said gently, "you need to be very careful here. What you're feeling might not be what you think it is." "What do you mean?" "I mean that you've just emerged from a painful relationship. You've spent months in isolation and bitterness, and I appeared at a moment when you were particularly vulnerable. What feels like attraction or affection might actually be relief or gratitude or simple loneliness seeking the nearest available object." Her psychological insight was both impressive and deeply uncomfortable. "You think I'm mistaking gratitude for something deeper? I think it's possible. I think it would be very easy, given the circumstances of how we met and what we've shared, for you to conflate rescue with romance." I considered her words seriously, testing them against my own emotional experience. Was she right? Was what I felt for her merely the magnified gratitude of someone who had been drowning and found an unexpected lifeline? "There's something else we need to discuss," she continued, when I didn't immediately respond. "Something about me, about my circumstances, that might change how you feel about whatever this is becoming." The way she spoke suggested revelations that might prove challenging, and I found myself both eager and terrified to hear what she had to say. "Tell me." She moved to the living room, settling onto the couch with the careful grace that characterized all her movements. I followed, taking the chair across from her, and waited while she gathered her thoughts. "You've been very polite about not pressing me for details about my past," she began, "about how I came to be homeless, about what my life was like before you found me in that doorway. But if we're going to continue this conversation, you need to know the truth. I'm listening." She was quiet for a long moment, her gaze fixed on her hands. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, but I could hear the effort it cost her to maintain that composure. "My name is Lily Chen, and until 6 months and 14 days ago, I was Dr. Lily Chen, a psychiatrist with a practice on the Upper East Side. I had an apartment, a car, a life that looked successful by any conventional measure." The revelation struck me like a physical blow. A doctor, a psychiatrist. The intelligence I had recognized in her, the sophisticated understanding of human nature she had displayed, the perfect social skills she had demonstrated at the wedding, all of it suddenly made sense. "What happened?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. "I had a patient," she continued, her voice taking on the flat tone of someone recounting a nightmare they had lived through repeatedly. "A young woman, brilliant and troubled, who came to me suffering from severe depression and suicidal ideation. I worked with her for 2 years, made real progress, thought I was helping her build a life worth living." She paused, and I could see the pain etched in every line of her face. "She killed herself on a Tuesday afternoon in March, left a note blaming her decision on the fact that therapy had made her more aware of her pain, without providing adequate tools to manage it. She specifically mentioned our last session, claimed that something I had said had pushed her over the edge. The silence that followed felt heavy with grief and guilt that I could barely begin to comprehend. I found myself wanting to reach for her, to offer some gesture of comfort, but something in her posture warned me away. "The family sued me for malpractice," she continued. "They claimed I had been negligent, that I had failed to properly assess the severity of her condition, that I should have had her committed for observation. The case was eventually dismissed, but the Professional Review Board launched their own investigation. My colleagues began to distance themselves, referrals dried up, the media picked up the story and turned it into a cautionary tale about the dangers of inadequate mental health care. I began to understand the magnitude of what she had lost. Your practice destroyed, my reputation ruined, my savings depleted by legal fees. And underneath all of that, the terrible knowledge that I had failed someone who had trusted me with her life. The pieces of her story came together in my mind like a puzzle, revealing a picture more tragic than I had imagined. "So you lost everything?" "Everything," she confirmed. "My license was eventually reinstated. The board found no evidence of actual malpractice, but by then it was too late. No one would hire me. No one would refer patients to me, and I couldn't afford to rebuild from nothing. I lost my apartment, my car, my entire support system. 6 months and 14 days ago, I found myself on the street with nowhere else to go." I sat in stunned silence, processing the implications of her revelation. This remarkable woman, who had navigated the complexities of Victoria's wedding with such skill, who had displayed such insight into human nature, who carried herself with such dignity despite her circumstances. She was not just homeless, she was a trained professional who had been brought low by tragedy and the cruel indifference of a society that demanded perfection from its healers. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" I asked finally. "Because I knew it would change how you saw me. Because I was afraid you would either pity me or judge me, and I couldn't bear either response. because it's easier to be seen as mysteriously homeless than as a failed doctor whose patient killed herself. Her honesty was both devastating and illuminating. I began to understand that her acceptance of my proposition had been motivated not just by desperate need, but by the opportunity to be seen as something other than a professional failure, to inhabit a role that didn't require her to confront the worst moment of her life. "You weren't a failure," I said, the words coming out more forcefully than I had intended. "What happened to your patient? That wasn't your fault." She looked at me with eyes that held years of accumulated guilt and self-recrimination. "Wasn't it? I was her doctor, her trusted counselor. She came to me for help, and she died feeling that I had made everything worse." People make their own choices, Lily. Terrible, tragic choices that have nothing to do with the quality of care they receive or the intentions of those trying to help them. I've told myself that 1,000 times. I've analyzed it from every possible angle, applied every technique I know for processing guilt and grief. Intellectually, I understand that suicide is a complex phenomenon with multiple contributing factors, that no single therapist bears responsibility for a patient's final decision, but intellectually understanding something and emotionally accepting it are very different things. The pain in her voice was so raw, so immediate, that I found myself abandoning my chair and moving to sit beside her on the couch. Without thinking, I reached for her hand, and she didn't pull away. "Is that why you've been on the streets for 6 months instead of trying to rebuild?" I asked gently. "Partly, but also because rebuilding would require me to believe that I deserve a second chance, that I'm capable of helping people rather than harming them. And I'm not sure I do believe that." The tragedy of her situation struck me with full force. Here was a woman who had dedicated her life to healing others, who possessed extraordinary insight into human nature, who had the training and ability to make a real difference in the world. And she had been reduced to living on the streets because one patient's mental illness had reached a tragic conclusion despite her best efforts. "Lily," I said, her name carrying all the conviction I could muster, "what you've told me doesn't change how I see you. If anything, it makes me admire you even more." She looked at me skeptically. "How can you say that? I'm a homeless woman whose professional failure drove her to the streets. You're a doctor who cared so deeply about her patients that when tragedy struck, you took responsibility, even when that responsibility wasn't yours to bear. You're someone who lost everything but maintained her dignity and humanity. You're someone who agreed to help a stranger with his emotional problems, despite having every reason to focus solely on your own survival." The words poured out of me with surprising force, and I realized that I meant every one of them. Her story didn't diminish her in my eyes. It revealed the depth of her character, the strength that had allowed her to survive months of hardship without losing the essential qualities that made her remarkable. "You don't understand," she said, though some of the tension had left her shoulders. "I can't go back to being a therapist. Even if I wanted to, even if I could find someone willing to hire me, I don't trust myself anymore. Every patient would remind me of Sarah. Every session would carry the weight of that failure." "Then don't go back to being a therapist," I said. "Be something else. Use your skills and insights in a different way. There are dozens of ways to help people that don't require sitting in an office processing individual trauma." She was quiet for a long moment, considering my words. "And what about us, Alexander? What about whatever this is that's developing between us? Does knowing the truth about my past change how you feel?" It was a fair question, one that required honest examination of my own motivations and emotions. Did learning about her professional background and the tragedy that had destroyed her career alter my feelings toward her? Did it make me see her differently, want different things from our relationship? "It changes how I see you," I said slowly, "but not in the way you might think. It makes me understand why you carry yourself with such dignity, why you seem to see people so clearly, why you were able to navigate last night's social complexity with such skill. It makes me realize that when I found you in that doorway, I wasn't rescuing someone helpless. I was encountering someone extraordinary who had been temporarily brought low by circumstances beyond her control. She searched my face, as though trying to determine the sincerity of my words. And it doesn't make you want to fix me, to save me from my circumstances and restore me to my former life. It makes me want to support you in whatever path you choose going forward. If you want to return to medicine in some form, I'll help you find a way to do that. If you want to pursue something entirely different, I'll support that too. But most of all, it makes me want to continue whatever this is between us, to see where it leads without the artificial constraints of our original arrangement. That's a dangerous path, Alexander. We come from very different worlds. We've both experienced significant trauma in recent months, and the circumstances of how we met are hardly conventional. Whatever we build together would have to overcome considerable obstacles. She was right, of course. A relationship between us would face challenges that most couples never had to navigate. The social implications alone would be significant. My business associates and social circle would struggle to understand and accept my involvement with a formerly homeless woman, regardless of her professional credentials. There would be gossip, speculation, perhaps even professional repercussions. But as I sat there beside her, her hand warm in mine, I realized that none of those obstacles seemed insurmountable. What mattered was the way I felt when I was with her, more alive, more genuinely myself, more connected to something meaningful than I had felt in years. I'm willing to face those obstacles, I said. The question is whether you are. She studied my face for a long moment, and I could see her weighing the risks against the possibilities, the potential for happiness against the certainty of complications. There's something else you should know, she said finally. Something that might change your answer. I waited, prepared for whatever additional revelation she felt compelled to share. Last night, at the wedding, when I was watching you with Victoria, when I saw the way you looked at her and the way she looked at you, I realized that what I feel for you has gone far beyond the boundaries of our business arrangement too. The admission hung between us like a gift, waiting to be accepted or rejected. I felt something ease in my chest, a tension I hadn't even realized I was carrying. So we're both in uncharted territory, I said. Yes, and we both have reasons to be cautious, but we also both have reasons to be hopeful. She smiled then, the first genuinely happy expression I had seen cross her features since she began her story. Yes, we do. I leaned toward her, drawn by an impulse I didn't fully understand, but trusted completely. She met me halfway, and when our lips touched, it felt like the completion of something that had been building between us since that first moment in the rain. The kiss was gentle, tentative, full of questions and possibilities rather than demands or assumptions. When we separated, I found myself looking into eyes that held not just attraction, but understanding, not just affection, but genuine partnership. So what happens now? She asked. Now we take things one day at a time. We figure out what we both want from this, what we're both willing to risk for it, and we build something real together. And my circumstances, my homelessness, my professional disgrace, my complete lack of resources, we deal with those things together. I have more money than I could spend in several lifetimes, but more importantly, I have connections, resources, and the ability to help you rebuild whatever kind of life you want. I won't be your charity case, Alexander. I won't be the homeless woman you rescued and transformed into something acceptable. I wouldn't want you to be. What I want is to be your partner in whatever comes next. Equal partners, each bringing our own strengths and resources to the relationship. She considered this, her head tilted in the thoughtful gesture I was beginning to recognize and cherish. Equal partners, she repeated. I like the sound of that. The rest of that day passed in a blur of conversation and revelation, as we shared stories from our pasts, explored the implications of our evolving relationship, and began to envision what our future together might look like. We talked about her potential return to medicine, perhaps in a research capacity or working with underserved populations who might be less concerned with professional scandal than with receiving quality care. We discussed the social challenges we would face and the ways we might address them together. As evening approached, we ordered dinner from a small restaurant in her former neighborhood, a choice that felt symbolic of our commitment to honoring her past while building toward a different future. We ate by candlelight on my terrace, the city spread out below us like a promise of all the possibilities that lay ahead. "I have a confession," Lily said as we finished our meal. "Another one?" I asked with mock alarm. "This one is less dramatic. I've been thinking about something you said earlier, about using my skills in a different way." "And?" "There's a clinic in the financial district that provides mental health services to homeless individuals. I've been aware of it for months, obviously, but I never considered the possibility that they might need someone with my background to help with program development or staff training. The idea struck me as brilliant. A way for her to return to her calling while working with a population that would understand her recent experiences in ways that more traditional patients never could. "That sounds perfect," I said. "Would you like me to make some inquiries?" "Actually," she said with a smile that suggested she had already been thinking along these lines, "I'd like to make them myself, tomorrow, if that's all right with you." "More than all right. I'm proud of you for thinking of it." "Don't be proud yet. Wait until I actually follow through." But I could see in her expression that she would follow through, that she was already beginning to envision a path back to meaningful work, to a life that honored both her professional training and her recent experiences. As we sat there in the candlelight, her hand in mine, I realized that Victoria's wedding had accomplished something far different than what I had originally intended. Instead of proving something to my ex-fiancé about the man I had become, it had revealed something to me about the man I wanted to be. Instead of closure with my past, it had opened the door to a future I could never have imagined. "Alexander," Lily said, her voice soft in the evening air. "Yes? Thank you. For the proposition, for last night, for today, for all of it. Thank you for saying yes to all of it." She leaned toward me across the small table, and I met her halfway for another kiss, this one deeper and more certain than the first. When we separated, I saw in her eyes not just affection or attraction, but something that looked remarkably like love. We were, I realized, both very different people than we had been just days earlier. She had moved from the streets to the possibility of rebuilding her career and finding genuine partnership. I had moved from bitter isolation to the promise of connection and shared purpose. It would not be easy, what we were building together. There would be challenges, setbacks, moments when the weight of our respective pasts threatened to overwhelm our shared future. But as I looked at this remarkable woman who had emerged from the rain to change the trajectory of my life, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: hope. The city lights twinkled below us like earthbound stars, each one representing a life, a story, a possibility. And somewhere among all those lights were two people who had found each other in the most unlikely circumstances and chosen to build something beautiful from the wreckage of their separate sorrows. What had begun as a desperate gambit to save face at an ex-fiancée's wedding had evolved into something neither of us could have predicted. The beginning of a love story built on mutual understanding, shared strength, and the recognition that sometimes the most profound connections emerge from the most unexpected encounters. As we finally went inside, hand in hand, I knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges and new possibilities. But whatever came next, we would face it together, two people who had lost everything and found each other, two hearts that had been broken and were slowly learning to beat in harmony. The homeless woman I had brought to Victoria's wedding was gone, replaced by the woman I was falling in love with, and the bitter, isolated man I had been was disappearing too, becoming someone I actually liked. Someone worthy of the extraordinary person who had chosen to take a chance on him. It was, I reflected as we said goodnight at the doors to our respective rooms, the best bargain I had ever made.